Good morning.
Good morning.
If you would be turning to Luke chapter 18 with me this morning. That's where we'll be today and next week. Luke chapter 18, we'll be looking at the first 8 verses, looking at the story that's here. So today, we are looking at this story that Jesus told about prayer. Because as we look at it, we begin to notice that Jesus saw praying very differently than most of us do. Jesus took praying to a totally different level. So if there's any moment in your life where praying seems to be boring or dull or just routine or extremely mechanical for you, there's a lot to learn from these 8 verses in Luke 18, recording the words of Jesus. Verse 1 of Luke 18. Now he, speaking of Jesus, he told them a parable on the need for them to pray always and not give up. So as soon as we start here in chapter 18, verse 1, when we need to remember this, when God's word explains the point of a parable before the parable is even told, then we really need to have our ears open. We need to have ears that will really hear what he's having to say. Because if we can understand Jesus' reason for telling this story, it's going to help clarify his emphasis throughout the story. So Jesus told this story to encourage the disciples, the 12, that they needed to pray, and they don't need to quit praying. Like in Matthew chapter 13, as we looked at multiple parables there, the stories there, Jesus told his disciples that until his second coming, evil would seem to prevail. So living by faith in God is not going to be easy. Living by faith in God is going to, in fact, be very hard and challenging at best. Jesus told his disciples that regular prayer would help to keep them spiritually strong. It would help to keep their hearts and their souls full of faith in God during this difficult life. So Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 26:41, Jesus, this is just before he's crucified, the night before, in fact, that he goes on trial. He says, because remember, he asked them to come to the garden with him as he prays, and that they fell asleep. So he said, stay awake and pray so that you won't enter into temptation. And then he gives this little caveat, which is so true. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We struggle because of the flesh. So what we need to understand as we come to prayer is our good intentions. Because a lot of us intend to pray regularly, and it just doesn't happen. But what we need to remember is our good intentions only get us so far. But we have to have right motive, and we have to have the will to do so. So through prayer, we begin to see through what Jesus is saying, he encourages us to understand that through prayer we tap into God's strength. So here's a reality. If you've ever prayed and you've stopped for a while, you experience this. If I stop praying to God, I begin to lose perspective, the perspective of God. And so my life really begins to feel overwhelming to me when I've stopped praying. And so after a while, I just quit trying to pray because I've allowed the world to establish my mindset. Now, the time between Jesus' first and second comings will be hard. It's going to be hard spiritually. It's going to be hard to stay true to his standard. It's going to be hard not to compromise what he calls us to be, especially for those who are his redeemed disciples. But regular prayer, consistent regular prayer, is a tool that God gives us to help us to stay strong. It's a tool that God gives us to help us stay effective in our spiritual walk and our spiritual growth. But persistent regular prayer was as difficult for the disciples in the first century as it is for us today in the 21st century. Verse 2 of chapter 18 in Luke. There was a judge in a certain town who did not fear God or respect people. It's interesting because you can go back and read history about this period of time among the Jews. And historians tell us that the judges in the city of Jerusalem were often called or referred to the robber judges. So if you wanted justice in Jerusalem, you had to pay for it. Now, Jewish history even tells us of judges that judged in villages. They would rule in your favor for a good pot roast. Okay? That was just a fact. That was a reality that the Jews in the first century in Palestine dealt with. So Jesus' disciples, as he's telling them this story, they're very aware of corrupt judges. They've lived with them all their lives. Jesus said that this judge, this man, he said he did not fear God or respect people. So when you cut those motives off from someone, how do you get them to do what they should do? It's very hard. So it's interesting here because the phrase Jesus used for did not respect people, in the Greek, it means he was not capable of feeling shame. Not that he didn't, he just wasn't capable of feeling shame. So the reality is that was and still is the harshest criticism you could make against anyone in a Middle Eastern culture. It meant they were not able to feel bad about things that they should feel bad about. Today, we tend to call those people sociopaths. That's the definition of it. So the first character in the story was an amoral, sociopathic judge. Boy, can you imagine taking your case there? Not much chance. Since he did not fear God, and since he did not respect people, the only way you could influence this judge was with money under the table. The only way you would get the decision you knew you needed was to pay up. So in verse 3, and a widow in that town kept coming to him, kept coming to this judge, saying, "Give me justice against my adversary." Now it's interesting that Jesus in this story interjects a widow. Because in the Old Testament, in the Jewish mindset, a widow symbolized anyone who was harmless and helpless. So Jesus is creating a scenario, a story, where the primary character is to be understood as harmless and helpless, couldn't do a thing. So this widow was way too weak to influence the judge in any capacity. And she was way too poor to even begin to imagine paying for some justice. So that's why the Old Testament says so much about the rights of the widow and the orphan. They were two of the most helpless and victimized members of Jewish society. In the Jewish legal system, the fact was, cases that involved orphans or widows were supposed to be put first on the docket because they had no one else to protect them but the courts. So they were totally at the mercy of the court. And widows and orphans, they were vulnerable to lawsuits, to thefts, and to oppression by the greedy people in the society around them. So that is why the widow in Jesus' story asks the court, asks the judge for protection. Someone, apparently, the implication is very strong, someone was trying to take her property from her. Or someone was trying to cheat her out of a debt that she was owed, or perhaps someone was trying to cheat her out of her inheritance. Now, even though widows and orphans were supposed to receive priority treatment, this judge in Jesus' story, he was not willing to hear her case. Notice again what verse 4 says. For a while, he was unwilling. Now, it's interesting as well to inject this into the story of Jesus. Jewish women in first century Palestine rarely entered a court. Very rarely. Because courts were considered and seen to be the domains of men. And so a male representative usually stood in place of a woman. And so this woman in the story had no one to represent her, no one to protect her. She had no one to persuade the judge for her. So this widow, from the implications of the story, the widow was in the right. But the judge had no desire to get involved at all on her behalf because she didn't have the necessary money to pay him the bribe that he expected. She couldn't bribe him. So she could do all that she had within her power to do. She would annoy him to death. So she hounded him. Day after day, she hounded him. Again, verse 3, Jesus said, a widow in that town kept coming to him, saying, now the reason she keeps coming, she doesn't have power, she doesn't have influence, she can't strong arm him, she can't bribe him. So she uses the only tool she knows. She kept coming to him saying, give me justice against my adversary. Now, I don't know if that's a challenge for you to think in those terms. I just share two things that Deborah and I experienced when we lived in two different cultures. And they functioned with this same mindset that we're reading here in this story. As foreign nationals, Deborah and I always had paperwork to fill out to be able to stay in that country. So the government offices had, as you walked into them, they had these long counters that separated us from the secretaries and the clerks. Now, the secretaries and the clerks, they were sitting at their desks, not looking at the counter or the people coming in, and they were smoking or drinking their coffee or painting their fingernails. They really had no interest in you being there, and they could care less what you were there for, though they were paid a salary to be there to help you. That wasn't important to them. So the waiting rooms began to be very packed because the people behind the long counters weren't doing what we thought they should be doing. So irritation began to grow in the waiting room. You could feel it. People began to yell and raise their voices and try to get attention. And so all the times we would go, because we weren't quite as pushy as that, we would just sit back and observe and try to figure out the best way to make this thing happen. And so every time we would watch certain people, they would quietly push through, no yelling, but they would push through to a clerk, whisper a few words in their ears, hand them an envelope, which they would politely call a gift. And then quickly they would walk out with all of their completed paperwork in hand. Meanwhile, everyone else is still yelling and pushing and shoving, and nothing's happening. But it's interesting because when those people came up with the gift, those salaried workers that were painting their fingernails and smoking and drinking their coffee, they immediately got up, prioritized that person's paperwork because they got paid under the table. It's a sad affair, but that was a common thing. Another occasion, a friend went with me to get my car inspected. We were packed in this corridor. It didn't smell great at all, like sardines. And these poor guys around me, I was nervous and sweating, and I'm quite a bit taller, and so their nose level would be my pit level. And I was like, sorry folks, that's just life. So my friend who went with me, I still call him a friend, but he began shouting. Didn't tell me anything. He just started shouting and pointing at me. Boy, talk about all shades of red. It's like, he's speaking Albanian, and I had no clue what he was saying, but I later learned, because he told me, because I asked him, what were you pointing at me and shouting about? And he said, well, this is what I was yelling to them. This is an American. Don't shame us by disrespecting our foreign guest. If I had known that's what he was saying, I'd have clamped it down pretty quick. And everyone was staring at me. I was embarrassed when he told me. I was still pretty embarrassed when it was happening. But as he's yelling, the men around us, whatever he was saying, and I don't know at the time, they started shouting back. Had no idea, but you can tell, even though you don't understand the language, you know what they're saying, it's not nice. They started shouting back, and they started shaking their paperwork in the air in their clenched fists. So my friend refused to be silent. And he kept yelling, and he kept screaming, until Lo and behold, the clerk up there motioned for us to come forward. So he gets me and says, follow me. So we're pushing through the crowd, and they don't look happy, and it's not the parting of the Red Sea, gladly doing it. There's a lot of resistance. So we pushed through the crowd of men that were in front of us. The clerk looked at me, and he basically said, what is it that you need? And I told him, and he quickly stamped my papers, apologized, and he told me this: Americans do not wait in line. Well, this American didn't know that. But what would have taken hours really just took minutes, because my friend annoyed and hounded the clerk, just like that woman was annoying and hounding the judge. So I have some experience of what it means to do that. So that reminded me of this situation in Jesus' story. In verses 4 and 5 of chapter 18. For a while, speaking of the judge, he was unwilling, but later he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or respect people, yet because this widow keeps pestering me, I will give her justice so that she doesn't wear me out by her persistent coming. Now, Jesus has a great sense of humor. You can tell in the word choices that he uses. This phrase in verse 5, so she doesn't wear me out, that wear me out, that was a boxing term. And really it's what they would say to describe the fact that you were punched in the eye. It wore me out. And so the widow, who is helpless and harmless and powerless, but she was extremely persistent, and she refused to give up. She was giving the judge a headache, a boxer's punch. That's how in Jesus, as he's describing the story, he's saying that's how the judge felt, was that this woman punched him in the eye, because she just kept coming back. She was a headache. So when someone's a headache, you give them what they want. And he did, just to get rid of her. Didn't care about justice, didn't care anything about her. He just wanted to stop her punching him in the eye verbally. So Jesus told this story to encourage his 12 disciples that they needed to keep praying, and they don't need to give up and quit praying as they're waiting for his return. Verses 6 to 8. Then the Lord said, so he continues the story, listen to what the unjust judge says. Will not God grant justice to his elect, who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay helping them? I tell you that he will swiftly grant them justice. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? See, Jesus in this story, he was not comparing God to the unwilling judge. You can't take that from the story. God is not an unwilling judge. We do not have to wear God out with prayers to get what we need. That's not what the story is. Jesus was using a style of reasoning that first century rabbis used and that he used. He made his case from lesser to greater. For example, if this is true about this judge, then this is so much more true about God. Matthew 7:11 is an example of this reasoning when Jesus says, if you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, that's lesser, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? It's that same logical reasoning and argument that he's using in the story that he tells us later about praying to God. So if a corrupt, sociopathic, amoral judge was persuaded by persistence, then we need to learn this, Jesus is saying, that your loving God is just the opposite. He is quick to listen. So the widow's situation was hopeless. A woman in a man's world with no money, with no man, no male representative to stand up for her. But this judge, he had no care at all what God thought. So you couldn't appeal to him based on his duty to God. His conscience was hardened, so there was no conscience to appeal to. Jesus' point is this. This woman, by persisting, she got exactly what she needed. So, how much more will you and I, living in difficult times, receive what we need in our lives through persistent prayer to a very loving God? Jesus told this story because he wanted to teach his 12 disciples, as he says in verse 1 of Luke 18, the need for them to pray always and not give up. If we get nothing else out of this story, we need to get that out of it, because that's not part of the story. He was just telling them why he told the story. We need to have examples. We need to understand. We need to always pray. And we don't ever need to stop praying. Now, some people think asking God for help is really a waste of time and probably even a sign of weakness, because we can do it ourselves, right? Some people handle prayer only as a personal discipline, like running 2 miles a day. They have a daily prayer routine at a certain time for a set time, but their prayers are rather mechanical. Really no passion, no relationship sense to them. For others, prayer is a last resort. When nothing else works, then you got to pray. And for some, prayer is like verbal journaling. They enjoy talking to God about themselves. And they don't expect God to provide anything or to work anything in their lives. And they're just wanting someone to listen to them talk. And many people wonder how something that's so very important seems to be so hard to do. Well, Jesus was definitely a man of prayer. And the further, you notice, the further he got into his ministry, the closer he got to the cross, he prayed more frequently, got away from the crowds more frequently. See, Jesus was definitely a man of prayer. His disciples grew up in a culture that emphasized regular daily praying. They saw people praying all the time on the streets, when they would go to the synagogue, at the temple. They were surrounded by prayer in their culture. But it's interesting because these guys who saw praying all the time asked Jesus to teach them to pray. I mean, they had examples all around them, right? But not like this. Because the people they saw in life didn't pray like Jesus prayed. They'd never seen anyone pray like Jesus. So this story reveals Jesus' perspective on prayer. It tells us why he prayed. It tells us how he prayed. And it tells us how he wants us to pray. So 3 lessons for us to learn. We'll just start in the first one, and next week we'll finish the first one and look at the last 2. The 3 lessons for us to learn from this story. First lesson: the greater the need, the better the prayer. You've noticed that in your own life. See, this widow was desperate. And desperation drives us to do things we don't do when we don't feel desperate. So since she was desperate, she was willing to make a fool of herself. That's why she went to this judge, to his court, day after day after day after day. To this judge who she knew, and everyone knew, he was greedy, he was unjust, and he had no care at all about what her needs were. Couldn't care less. But she had nowhere else to go. That was her only chance. She was desperate to find remedy for her problem. So here's her thinking. If this judge, if this court did not protect her, then she was totally at the mercy of her enemies that were trying to take something that she desperately needed to live. So this widow, because she was desperate, she swallowed her pride. She broke cultural norms. She totally went against what culture expected you to be like. And she fearlessly kept after this judge until she wore him down and she got not what she wanted, she got what she needed, what she desperately needed in her life. What would you do in her situation? Would you give up? Would you let injustice win? Or would you find a friend like I had who would go and yell for you? What do you do? But see, the widow didn't do any of that. The widow used what she had. Because of desperation, she kept going because she had no other options. We need to understand that. Because we rarely in this society ever get to a point where we don't feel like we have no other options. But that's the gist of this woman's life in the story of Jesus. And that's really a lot of people's lives on a daily basis in this world that we're just not privy to. We are totally naive to how many people in this world live with a sense of desperation. Jesus taught that prayer becomes real and prayer becomes fervent when I realize how desperate I am and that God is my only hope. That God is my only way out. That God is my only answer. That God is my only solution to the junk in my world. Maybe you have no job. That sometimes makes us feel desperate. Maybe you have no money in your pockets, no money anywhere, and we can feel desperate. And maybe your kids are starving, and that desperation sometimes leads you to do things that aren't necessarily right. Maybe right now you're hiding in a basement of a church building as bombs are destroying your city. There are people right now in our world who know desperation. They have no options. That was this woman. That's the mindset we need to have as humans. Even in our comfort, even in our convenience, we need to break free from it to feel a sense of desperation for God. Because we think so often that we can handle it on our own. We can't. It's a deception. And someday, at some point, God may pull that deception out from underneath us, and we're desperate. But more than likely, if we haven't prayed now, we will not pray then. We need to make certain we're prepared every day to desperately need God in our lives. In situations where there is no way that you can handle it on your own, you know that you need God's help. That should be us every day. I cannot make it on my own any day because of the spiritual war that's going on. And when we realize that, we will pray more and we will pray harder. But we often don't because we don't feel desperate. So have you forgotten how much you really do need God in your life? It's so easy for us to build a life where we don't think we need Him. That's a life built on deception. It's a life of cards. Have you bought into the lie that you're self-sufficient? That you don't need God or anybody else? We often get there because we get angry and hurt and put up barriers so we can't get hurt again. God's not going to hurt us at all. God's only for us. If you need spiritual strength, if you desire a deeper faith, then we're here to encourage you, to pray with you, whatever you need. If we can help you, please come as we stand together, as we sing.